The mountain air in Pine Ridge, Colorado, carried a clarity that felt almost holy. At 8,000 feet above sea level, the thin atmosphere had a way of making colors sharper, sounds crisper, and thoughts unavoidable. Senior Chief Petty Officer James Granite Mallory stood on the weathered deck of his brother's cabin, a steaming mug of black coffee in his hands, watching the sun climb over the jagged peaks of the Rockies. He had been here for 3 days, and it was the first time in 15 years of service that he'd taken leave without having to be ordered. The silence was profound. No radio chatter, no helicopter rotors, no barked commands. Just the whisper of wind through pine trees and the occasional cry of a hawk circling the valley below. Behind him, lying in a perfect sphinx position on the sun-warmed wood, was Odin. The 4-year-old Belgian Malinois was a study in controlled power. 85 pounds of lean muscle, deep mahogany coat with a black mask, and eyes the color of amber that tracked every movement with an intelligence that bordered on unsettling. Odin was a multi-purpose canine, cross-trained in explosives detection, patrol work, and tactical support. He had served alongside James through 2 deployments in the Middle East, and had saved his life twice, once by detecting an IED buried beneath a false floor, and once by taking down an armed insurgent who had gotten the drop on James during a close-quarters firefight. But here, in the quiet mountains, Odin was simply his partner, his brother, his family. "Easy morning, boy," James said softly, not turning around. Odin's ears rotated forward at the sound of his handler's voice, but he didn't move. He didn't need to. The bond between them required no leashes, no commands, no force. It was built on thousands of hours of shared experience, on mutual trust forged in the crucible of combat. James could communicate an entire tactical plan with a gesture no larger than a raised eyebrow. Odin could read his handler's emotional state from the rhythm of his breathing. It was the silent bond, a philosophy James had learned from the old-school handlers, the ones who understood that a canine wasn't a tool to be wielded, but a partner to be respected. James took a long sip of his coffee and allowed himself a rare moment of peace. He was 34 years old, and he felt twice that. The scars on his body told stories he'd never share with civilians, and the weight in his chest, the one that never quite went away, was the accumulated grief of brothers lost, missions that went sideways, and the constant gnawing knowledge that the war would always be there, waiting for him to come back. This leave was supposed to be about healing, about remembering who he was when he wasn't Senior Chief Mallory, when he wasn't Granite, the operator who never flinched, never hesitated, never broke. The cabin belonged to his older brother, Marcus, a park ranger who had built a life in these mountains far from the chaos James had chosen. Marcus was away on a week-long wildlife survey, and he'd offered James the space without question, understanding that sometimes a warrior needed solitude more than conversation. "Maybe I could stay," James murmured to himself, watching the light play across the valley. "Maybe I could just stop." Odin lifted his head at the shift in his handler's tone, sensing the conflict. He rose smoothly to his feet and padded over, pressing his warm body against James's leg. The gesture was simple. "I'm here. You're not alone." James reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease just slightly. "Yeah, boy," he said quietly. "I know." The peace would last exactly 2 more hours. 15 miles down the mountain, in the small town of Pine Ridge proper, Dr. Sarah Chen was already 3 hours into her day. The Pine Ridge Veterinary Clinic was a modest building on the edge of town, a single-story structure with faded blue siding, and a hand-painted sign that had been there since the 1982nd. It served the scattered ranches, the handful of small farms, and the pet owners in a 50-mile radius. Sarah had taken over the practice 4 years ago when the previous vet retired, and she had poured her heart and soul into making it a place of healing. At 38, she was a woman of quiet competence. Her black hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her dark eyes held a warmth that put even the most anxious animals at ease. She wore simple scrubs decorated with cartoon dogs and cats, a concession to the younger clients who came in clutching their beloved pets. This morning, she was finishing up a routine check on a golden retriever named Biscuit when the bell above the clinic door chimed. "Be right with you," she called out, her voice cheerful. She heard the shuffle of boots on the linoleum floor and the low murmur of a man's voice. She gave Biscuit's owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Kowalski, a reassuring smile. "He's in perfect health, Mrs. K. Just keep him on the joint supplements and he'll be chasing squirrels for years to come." "Thank you, dear," Mrs. Kowalski said, her face lighting up with relief. Sarah walked her to the front desk, processed the payment, and then turned to greet her next visitor. The man standing in her waiting room was someone she'd never seen before, and that was unusual in a town as small as Pine Ridge. He was in his late 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of build that came from years of hard physical labor. His face was weathered, deeply tanned, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the room in a single sweep. He wore a denim jacket over a flannel shirt, work boots, and a belt with a large silver buckle shaped like an elk. But it was the dog at his side that made Sarah pause. The animal was a German shepherd, a beautiful specimen with a thick coat and intelligent eyes. But something was wrong. The dog was, panting heavily despite the cool morning, its tongue lolling out in a way that suggested distress rather than exertion. Its gait was unsteady, and when it sat at the man's command, it leaned heavily to one side. "Good morning," Sarah said, her professional instincts immediately taking over. "I'm Dr. Chen. What's going on with your boy here?" The man's expression was carefully neutral, but Sarah could see the tension in his jaw. "Name's Garrett Voss," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This is Gunner. He's been off his food for 2 days. This morning he started stumbling, and his breathing's been heavy." Sarah knelt, moving slowly so as not to startle the dog. "Hey, Gunner," she said softly. "Let's take a look at you, buddy." Gunner turned his head toward her, and she saw it, the slight glaze over his eyes, the tremor in his limbs, the way his pupils were dilated despite the bright fluorescent lights overhead. Her heart sank. "How long have you had him?" she asked, her hands gently palpating the dog's abdomen. 6 years, Garrett said. "He's a working dog, helps me with livestock on my property up near Timber Creek." Sarah nodded, her mind racing through possibilities. Poisoning? Toxin exposure? Neurological event? "I need to run some tests," she said, standing up. "Can you bring him into the exam room?" Garrett lifted the dog with surprising gentleness, carrying the 70-pound animal as if he weighed nothing. Sarah led them into the back, her professional calm masking the growing unease in her chest. As she began her examination, drawing blood, checking vitals, running a urinalysis, she noticed something else. Garrett Voss was watching her with an intensity that went beyond concern for his dog. His eyes tracked her every movement, and there was a tightness around his mouth that suggested he was holding something back. "Mr. Voss," she said carefully, "has Gunner been exposed to anything unusual? Chemicals, fertilizers, anything he might have ingested?" Garrett was silent for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "Nothing unusual." But Sarah had spent years reading the body language of animals, and she'd learned that humans weren't so different. Garrett Voss was lying. Garrett Voss was lying because he was terrified. 3 weeks ago, his life had been simple. He owned 40 acres of land on the eastern edge of the Rockies, ran a small herd of cattle, and kept to himself. He paid his taxes, helped his neighbors when they needed it, and asked for nothing in return. Then the Caldwell Group had made him an offer. They wanted his land, not to buy it exactly, but to lease a portion of it, a remote section near the northern border, where the forest was thick and the terrain rugged. They'd offered him $10,000 a month, cash, for access to a single service road and the right to place a small storage facility on the property. It was more money than Garrett made in 6 months, and his initial instinct had been to take it, but then he'd met the men from Caldwell, and everything in his gut had screamed danger. The leader was a man named Damon Cross. He was in his mid-50s, with silver hair combed back from a high forehead, and he wore expensive suits that looked out of place in rural Colorado. He smiled easily, but his eyes were the cold, dead eyes of a predator. He spoke in a smooth, cultured voice, but every word felt like a threat wrapped in velvet. Garrett had said no. 2 days later, his fence line had been cut, and 3 of his cattle had wandered onto the highway. 1 had been killed by a semi-truck. 4 days after that, his water well had been contaminated with diesel fuel. And then, this morning, Gunnar, his loyal, healthy, 6-year-old German shepherd, had collapsed in the yard, his body racked with tremors. Garrett knew it wasn't an accident. He knew what this was. This was a message. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Now, standing in the veterinary clinic, watching Dr. Chen work with focused intensity to save his dog's life. Garrett felt the weight of his silence like a stone in his chest. He wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to explain that powerful men were trying to force him off his land, that they were willing to hurt innocent animals to make their point, that he was scared not just for himself, but for anyone who might get caught in the crossfire. But he also knew that telling her would put her in danger. So he said nothing. Dr. Chen finished her initial examination and stepped back, her expression grave. "Mr. Voss," she said, "Gunnar is showing signs of acute toxin exposure. His liver enzymes are elevated, his neurological function is compromised, and his heart rate is dangerously irregular. I need to start him on IV fluids and activated charcoal immediately, and I'll need to run a full toxicology panel to identify what he's been exposed to." Garrett's jaw tightened. "Will he make it?" "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. "It depends on what he ingested and how much. The next 12 hours are critical." She paused, her dark eyes searching his face. "Mr. Voss, if you know what Gunnar was exposed to, it would help me immensely. Even a guess could save his life." Garrett looked down at his dog, who was now lying on the exam table, his breathing shallow and labored. He felt a surge of rage so powerful it threatened to choke him. "I don't know," he said, the lie bitter on his tongue. Sarah didn't believe him. That much was clear, but she simply nodded and turned back to her work. "I'll do everything I can," she said. As she moved to prepare the IV, the bell above the clinic door chimed again. Sarah's assistant, a young woman named Kelsey, poked her head into the exam room. "Dr. Chen, there's a man here to see Mr. Voss. He says it's urgent." Garrett's blood turned to ice. "I didn't tell anyone I was coming here," he said quietly. Sarah frowned. "Do you want me to tell him you're not available?" Before Garrett could answer, a new voice cut through the clinic, smooth and cold as a frozen river. "No need for that, doctor." "I'll wait." Garrett turned, his body going rigid. Standing in the doorway of the exam room, his expensive gray suit, a stark contrast to the modest surroundings, was Damon Cross. He was flanked by 2 other men, both younger, both built like brick walls. They wore dark jackets and had the flat, emotionless eyes of men who had done terrible things and would do them again without hesitation. Cross's smile was warm and welcoming, but it never reached his eyes. "Hello, Garrett," he said pleasantly. "I heard your dog was sick. Such a shame. I hope he pulls through." The threat was implicit, hanging in the air like smoke. Sarah, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, stepped forward, her voice firm. "I'm sorry, but this is a private medical facility. If you're not here with an animal that needs treatment, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Cross turned his attention to her, and for a moment his mask slipped. She saw the cold calculation, the complete lack of empathy. Then the smile returned. "Of course, doctor, we don't want to intrude. We'll wait outside. Take all the time you need." He turned and walked out, his 2 enforcers following like shadows. The moment they were gone, Sarah turned to Garrett, her eyes blazing. "Who the hell was that?" Garrett's hands were shaking. "Trouble?" he said quietly. That was trouble. The sun climbed higher over Pine Ridge, indifferent to the quiet terror unfolding below. In the back room of the veterinary clinic, Dr. Sarah Chen worked with the focused intensity of a surgeon in a war zone. Gunner lay on the stainless steel table, an IV line running into his front leg, pumping fluids and activated charcoal into his system in a desperate attempt to flush the poison from his body. Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision, but her mind was racing. The toxicology panel would take hours to come back from the lab in Denver, but she didn't need a lab report to know what she was looking at. Gunner's symptoms, the tremors, the dilated pupils, the elevated liver enzymes, the cardiac arrhythmia, were consistent with organophosphate poisoning, likely from a pesticide or industrial chemical. This wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately poisoned this dog, and the man in the gray suit waiting outside knew exactly who had done it. Garrett Voss stood in the corner of the exam room, his arms crossed, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. He watched his dog struggle for every breath, and Sarah could see the war happening behind his eyes, the urge to go outside and confront the men who had done this, battling against the knowledge that doing so would likely get him killed. "Mr. Voss," Sarah said quietly, not taking her eyes off Gunner's vitals. "I need you to tell me what's going on." Garrett was silent for a long moment. "They want my land," he said finally, his voice low and bitter. "The Caldwell Group. They're some kind of development company out of Denver. They made me an offer. I said no, and now they're making sure I regret it." Sarah's hand stilled. "They did this? They poisoned your dog?" "I can't prove it," Garrett said. "But yeah, this is them sending a message." Sarah felt a cold fury settle in her chest. She had dedicated her life to healing animals, to protecting the innocent creatures who couldn't defend themselves. The idea that someone would deliberately harm a dog, a loyal, working animal who had done nothing but serve his owner faithfully, filled her with a rage she rarely allowed herself to feel. "We need to call the police," she said. "No," Garrett said sharply. "We don't." "Why not?" "Because the Caldwell Group has been buying up land all over this county for the past year, and they've got connections. Sheriff's Department, county, commissioners, the mayor. They're everywhere. If I go to the cops, all I'll do is paint a bigger target on my back." Sarah turned to face him, her dark eyes flashing. "So you're just going to let them get away with this?" "I didn't say that," Garrett replied. "But I'm not stupid enough to think the law is going to help me." Before Sarah could respond, the door to the clinic burst open. The sound was explosive, the glass rattling in its frame. Kelsey's startled cry echoed from the front desk. Heavy footsteps crossed the waiting room, moving with purpose. Sarah stepped in front of Gunner, her body instinctively positioning itself between the sick dog and whatever was coming. The door to the exam room flew open. Damon Cross stood in the doorway, his two enforcers behind him. The smile was gone. In its place was the cold, reptilian expression of a man who had decided that subtlety was no longer necessary. "Garrett," Cross said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "I think we need to have a conversation. Outside. Right now." Garrett didn't move. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Cross sighed, as if dealing with a stubborn child. "See, that's the problem, Garrett. You keep saying no. You keep thinking you have a choice. But you don't." He gestured to one of his enforcers, a thick-necked man with a shaved head and a scar running from his temple to his jaw. "Mr. Taggart here has been very patient. But his patience is running out." Taggart cracked his knuckles, the sound loud in the small room. Sarah's heart was pounding, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "Get out of my clinic. Now." Cross turned his attention to her, and for the first time she saw genuine annoyance in his eyes. "Doctor, this doesn't concern you. Walk away, and you won't get hurt." "This is my clinic," Sarah said, her voice like steel. "And you're threatening one of my patients and his owner. That makes it very much my concern." Cross studied her for a long moment, then shrugged. "Fine, you want to be a hero? Let's see how that works out for you." He nodded to Taggart. The enforcer moved with brutal efficiency. He crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbed Garrett by the front of his shirt, and slammed him against the wall. The impact was bone-rattling, the sound echoing through the clinic. Garrett tried to fight back, but Taggart was a professional. He drove a fist into Garrett's stomach, doubling him over, then followed up with a vicious elbow to the side of his head. Garrett crumpled to the floor, gasping for air. Sarah screamed, "Stop! You're going to kill him!" Cross turned to her, his expression utterly calm. "That's the idea, Doctor." He walked over to the exam table where Gunner lay, the dog too weak to even lift his head. "You know," Cross said conversationally, "I've always found it interesting how much people care about their pets. More than they care about themselves, sometimes." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small vial filled with a clear liquid. Sarah's blood ran cold. "What is that?" "This," Cross said, holding it up to the light, "is a very concentrated solution of ethylene glycol. Antifreeze. To the layman. Very toxic to dogs. Just a few milliliters will cause complete kidney failure. Very painful, very slow." He uncapped the vial. "You're insane," Sarah whispered. "No," Cross said, "I'm efficient. Garrett here needs to understand that when I make a request, it's not optional." He turned to Garrett, who was still on the floor, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. "Sign the lease, Garrett, or I finish what I started with your dog. Right here, right now." Garrett looked up, his face twisted with pain and helpless rage. "You son of a Cross," poured the vial onto Gunner's face. The liquid splashed across the dog's muzzle, soaking into his fur. Gunner whimpered, a soft, pitiful sound, and tried to lift his head, but he was too weak. Sarah lunged forward, grabbing a towel, and began frantically wiping the liquid away, her hands shaking with fury and terror. "You bastard!" she screamed. "You're going to kill him!" "Yes," Cross said calmly, "I am. Unless Garrett signs." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket and dropped it on the floor next to Garrett. "You have 10 seconds to decide." Garrett stared at the paper, then at his dog, and Sarah saw the moment his spirit broke. He reached for the pen, and that was when the door to the clinic opened again, this time quietly, like a ghost slipping into the room. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. A voice, low and cold as a glacier, cut through the chaos. "Step away from the dog." James Mallory had been on his way back from a supply run in town when he'd driven past the veterinary clinic and noticed the black SUV parked out front. It was the kind of vehicle that didn't belong in Pine Ridge, too expensive, too polished, too predatory. And the two men standing outside it, scanning the street with the flat, alert gaze of hired muscle, had triggered every instinct James had honed over 15 years of combat. Something was wrong. He'd parked his truck a block away, told Odin to stay in the cab, and approached on foot, his movements silent, his mind already running through tactical assessments. When he'd heard the scream, a woman's voice, sharp and terrified, he hadn't hesitated. Now he stood in the doorway of the exam room, taking in the scene with the speed and clarity of an operator in the field. A man on the floor, bleeding. A woman in scrubs, her hands covered in some kind of liquid, frantically wiping down a sick dog. And 3 men, 1 in a suit, 2 in tactical gear, standing over them like wolves circling prey. James's gray eyes locked onto Damon Cross, and in that instant, he knew exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. A predator. A man who believed power made him untouchable. James stepped into the room, his body language loose and relaxed, but his voice carrying the unmistakable weight of command. I said, "Step away from the dog." Cross turned, irritation flickering across his face. "Who the hell are you?" James didn't answer. He simply held the man's gaze, his expression utterly calm, utterly confident. Taggart, the enforcer, squared his shoulders and took a step forward. "This is private business, friend. Turn around and walk away." James's eyes flicked to Taggart, assessing him in a fraction of a second. Ex-military, probably Army, dishonorably discharged. Strong but undisciplined. Aggressive but sloppy. "No," James said simply. The second enforcer, a wiry man with dead eyes and a knife scar on his neck, moved to flank James, trying to box him in. James saw it coming before the man even moved. "Last chance," James said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "Walk away." Cross laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "No," James said, "and I don't care." He looked past Cross to Sarah, who was staring at him with wide, desperate eyes. "Ma'am, is the dog going to make it?" Sarah blinked, caught off guard by the calm, professional tone. I don't know. They poured poison on him. I need to flush it out immediately, or he'll die." James nodded. "Then you'd better get to work." He looked back at Cross, and for the first time the predator saw something in the stranger's eyes that made him hesitate. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was the cold, absolute certainty of a man who had killed before and would do it again without hesitation if the mission required it. "You have 3 seconds to leave this clinic," James said. 3, 2. Taggart moved first. He lunged forward, swinging a heavy right hook aimed at James's jaw. James didn't block it. He redirected it. He stepped inside the punch, caught Taggart's wrist with his left hand, and twisted, using the man's own momentum against him. The joint lock was instant and brutal, hyper-extending the elbow at an angle that sent a white-hot lance of pain. Up Taggart's arm. The enforcer screamed. James drove his right palm into Taggart's solar plexus, a short, vicious strike that emptied the man's lungs and sent him stumbling backward, gasping for air. The second enforcer pulled a knife. Big mistake. James saw the blade coming, sidestepped it with the economy of motion that came from 1,000 training drills, and delivered a precise strike to the man's wrist. The knife clattered to the floor. Before the enforcer could recover, James grabbed him by the back of the neck and drove his knee into the man's stomach. The man folded like a house of cards and collapsed onto the linoleum, retching. The entire exchange had taken less than 5 seconds. James straightened, barely breathing hard, and looked at Cross. 1. Cross stood frozen, his face pale, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Okay," he said, his voice shaking. "Okay, we're leaving." James stepped aside, gesturing to the door. Smart choice. Cross and his 2 injured. Enforcers limped out of the clinic, their bravado shattered. As the door closed behind them, James turned to Sarah and Garrett, his expression softening just slightly. "You okay?" Sarah nodded, her hand still shaking. "Thank you." "I thank you." James knelt next to Garrett, who was staring up at him with a mix of awe and disbelief. "Can you stand?" "Yeah," Garrett said hoarsely. "I think so." James helped him to his feet, then turned his attention to the dog on the table. Gunner's breathing was shallow, his body trembling. "What does he need?" James asked. "I need to flush the toxin off his skin and get him stabilized," Sarah said, already moving back to the table. "But they'll come back. You know they will." James's jaw tightened. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know." He looked at Garrett. "Who are they?" Garrett told him everything. The Caldwell Group, the threats, the poisoning. By the time he finished, James's expression had gone cold and hard as granite. "Do you know where they're operating from?" "They've got a facility," Garrett said. "On the northern edge of my property. I've seen trucks coming and going at night. Big ones. I don't know what they're moving, but it's not legal." James nodded slowly, his tactical mind already working through the problem. This wasn't just about protecting one man and his dog. This was about exposing a criminal operation that had infiltrated a small town and was using violence and intimidation to achieve its goals. This was a mission. And Senior Chief James Granite Mallory didn't leave missions unfinished. Outside the clinic, Damon Cross sat in the back seat of his SUV, his hands clenched into fists, his mind racing. He had been in the game long enough to recognize a professional when he saw one. The stranger in the clinic wasn't just some good Samaritan who happened to wander in at the right moment. He was trained. Military most likely. Special operations, if Cross had to guess. And that was a problem. Cross pulled out his phone and dialed a number. It was answered on the first ring. "We have a situation," Cross said, his voice tight. There's a civilian interfering with the Voss operation. He took down Taggart and Reeves in under 10 seconds. We need to escalate. There was a long pause on the other end. How do you want to handle it? I want the asset removed, Cross said, permanently, and I want it done tonight. Understood. Cross hung up and stared out the window at the quiet mountain town. He had spent a year building the Caldwell Group's operation here, using Pine Ridge as a front for something much larger and much darker. They were moving weapons, high-grade military equipment stolen from overseas bases and sold to the highest bidder on the black market. The operation was worth millions, and Garrett Voss's property was the linchpin. The service road on his land provided direct access to an old mining tunnel that ran under the mountains, a perfect smuggling route that bypassed every checkpoint and law enforcement agency in the state. Cross had crushed a dozen men like Voss before. One more wouldn't matter. But the stranger was a variable he couldn't control. And variables had to be eliminated. Back inside the clinic, James stood by the exam table, watching as Sarah worked to stabilize Gunner. The dog was holding on, but barely. Odin, who had been waiting patiently in the truck, suddenly appeared at James's side. The Malinois had sensed his handler's shift from civilian to operator mode and had come to offer his support. James rested a hand on Odin's head, feeling the steady, grounding presence of his partner. Sarah glanced at the new arrival and did a double-take. "That's your dog?" "Yeah," James said. "This is Odin." Odin sat at perfect attention, his amber eyes focused on Gunner, as if understanding that the other dog was in trouble. Sarah felt a small surge of hope. "He's beautiful." "He's the best," James said simply. Garrett, who had slumped into a chair, looked up at James with desperate eyes. "What do we do now? Cross isn't going to let this go." James was silent for a long moment, his mind working through the tactical problem. "We gather evidence," he said finally. "We find out exactly what they're doing on your property, we document it, and we bring it to the authorities who aren't compromised." "How?" Garrett asked. "Cross owns half this town." James's gray eyes were cold and hard. "Then we go over his head. Federal authorities, FBI, DEA. Someone who won't be bought off." He looked at Sarah. "Can you keep Gunner stable for the next few hours?" "Yes," she said. "But if Cross comes back—" "He won't," James said. "Not tonight. He's going to regroup, reassess, and come at us with a different strategy. That gives us a window." He turned to Garrett. "I need you to take me to your property. Show me this facility. I need to see what we're dealing with." Garrett nodded, his jaw set. "Let's go." As they prepared to leave, Sarah grabbed James's arm. "Be careful," she said. "These people are dangerous." James looked down at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a deep, bone-deep weariness. "So am I," he said quietly. And with that, he and Odin walked out into the Colorado night, ready to face whatever darkness awaited them. The drive to Garrett Voss's property took 20 minutes, the road climbing higher into the mountains, the air growing thinner and colder. James sat in the passenger seat of Garrett's battered pickup truck. Odin in the back, his eyes scanning the darkening landscape with tactical precision. Garrett's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his jaw tight with a mixture of fear and anger. "The facility is about 2 miles from my house," he said. "Hidden in a clearing near the old mining access road. I've only seen it from a distance, but there are lights, trucks, armed guards." James nodded, his mind already building a tactical picture. "How? Many guards?" "At least 4 that I've seen, maybe more." "Weapons? Rifles? Handguns?" "They're not pretending to be civilians." James pulled out his phone and opened a satellite map of the area, studying the terrain. "We approach from the west," he said. "Use the tree line for cover. We get close, we observe, we document. We do not engage unless we have no choice." Garrett glanced at him. "You've done this before." "It wasn't a question." "Yeah," James said. "I have." They parked the truck a mile away, deep in the forest where it wouldn't be seen, and continued on foot. Odin moved beside James like a shadow, his body low, his senses alert. The dog understood that this was a different kind of work, not training, not play, but a real mission where the stakes were life and death. The forest was thick with pine and aspen, the ground soft with decades of fallen needles. The only sounds were the whisper of wind and the distant hoot of an owl. As they crept closer to the facility, James dropped into a crouch, signaling Odin to do the same. Garrett followed his lead, moving as quietly as his inexperience would allow. Through the trees, James saw it. The clearing was larger than he'd expected, lit by portable floodlights that cast harsh white light across a makeshift compound. There were 3 prefabricated buildings, storage units, most likely, and a large covered loading area where 2 semi-trucks were parked, their engines idling. Men moved between the trucks and the buildings, carrying wooden crates marked with international shipping codes. James pulled out a small pair of binoculars and focused on one of the crates. The markings were in Cyrillic, Russian. His blood ran cold. "What is it?" Garrett whispered. "Those crates," James said quietly. "They're military grade, Russian origin. If I had to guess, we're looking at small arms AK variants, RPGs, maybe even explosives." "Jesus," Garrett breathed. James continued his observation, counting the guards. 6. Visible, all armed with AR-15 style rifles. They moved with discipline, scanning the perimeter at regular intervals. This wasn't just a smuggling operation. This was a professional military logistics network. He pulled out his phone and began taking photos, documenting everything: the trucks, the crates, the guards, the facility layout. That's when Odin's body went rigid. The Malinois' ears snapped forward, and a low, almost inaudible growl rumbled in his chest. James's hand immediately went to Odin's collar, a silent command: alert, danger. He scanned the tree line, his eyes searching for the threat Odin had detected. There, 200 yards to their left, moving through the forest with the confidence of predators, were 4 men. They were dressed in black tactical gear, carrying suppressed firearms, and they were moving in a standard patrol pattern. They were hunting. James's mind raced. Cross had anticipated this. He'd sent a team to sweep the area for intruders. "We need to move," James whispered urgently. "Now." But it was too late. One of the patrol members turned, his eyes sweeping the forest, and for a split second his gaze locked onto James's position. The man raised his rifle. James moved on pure instinct. "Down!" He barked at Garrett, shoving him to the ground. The first shot was a suppressed cough, the bullet striking a tree trunk 6 inches from James's head, sending splinters of bark exploding into the air. James grabbed Odin's tactical vest and rolled behind a fallen log, his mind shifting instantly into combat mode. 3 more shots followed, each one precise, each one searching. "Odin, guard," James commanded. The Malinois understood. He positioned himself between James and the threat, his body coiled, ready to launch. James assessed the situation with the speed of an operator. 4 hostiles, suppressed weapons, night vision capability. They had the advantage of numbers and equipment. But James had something they didn't. He had 15 years of training in the most elite fighting force on the planet. "Garrett, stay down and don't move," James hissed. Then he moved. He burst from cover, not retreating but advancing at an angle, using the terrain to his advantage. The patrol members were trained, but they were mercenaries used to fighting in open spaces, not in dense forest, against a SEAL who had been trained in asymmetric warfare. The first hostile turned to track him, but James was already gone, slipping behind a thick stand of aspen. He heard the rustle of footsteps, the quiet click of a radio. "Target is mobile, northeast quadrant." James's hand went to his belt. He didn't carry a firearm on leave protocol, prohibited it, but he had something just as effective. A tactical knife, 7 inches of blackened steel, honed to a razor edge. He waited, controlling his breathing, his heart rate dropping into the calm, focused state of a predator. The first hostile came around the tree line, his rifle raised, scanning. James struck. He moved from a crouch, closing the distance in 2 silent steps, and drove his shoulder into the man's ribs, using his weight to slam him against a tree. The impact knocked the wind out of the hostile, and before he could recover, James's knife was at his throat. "Drop the weapon," James said, his voice a low, cold whisper. The man complied, his rifle falling to the forest floor. "Who sent you?" "Cross," the man gasped. "We're Caldwell Security. We were told to eliminate any intruders." "How many of you?" "4. 2 more teams sweeping the perimeter." James pressed the blade just slightly harder. "You're going to walk away. You're going to tell Cross that he's dealing with someone who won't be intimidated. And if he comes after me or anyone I'm protecting again, I will end this operation and everyone in it. Do you understand?" The man nodded frantically. James released him, and the man scrambled away, disappearing into the darkness. A sharp whistle cut through the air. "Odin's alert." James spun. The second hostile had flanked him, his rifle aimed directly at James's chest. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. And then 85 pounds of trained Belgian Malinois exploded from the shadows. Odin hit the hostile like a missile, his jaws clamping down on the man's forearm with bone-crushing force. The rifle fired wild, the shot echoing through the forest, and then the man was on the ground screaming. Odin's teeth locked on his arm. "Odin, release!" James commanded. The dog obeyed instantly, stepping back, his body still coiled, ready to attack again if necessary. James grabbed the man's rifle, ejected the magazine, and cleared the chamber with practiced efficiency. He looked down at the hostile, who was clutching his mangled arm, blood seeping between his fingers. "Get out of here," James said. "And tell Cross this is his only warning." The man stumbled to his feet and ran, leaving a trail of blood behind him. James stood in the clearing, his chest heaving, adrenaline flooding his system. He heard the distant sound of engines starting, voices shouting. The compound was on alert. They had to move. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more incredible true stories of courage and loyalty. He turned back to where Garrett was huddled behind the log. "We're leaving, now!" They moved quickly through the forest, James leading the way with Odin at his side. Behind them, the facility was alive, with activity searchlights sweeping the trees, vehicles moving out to patrol the roads. But by the time the Caldwell security team had organized a proper sweep, James, Odin, and Garrett were long gone, disappearing into the mountains like ghosts. They made it back to Garrett's truck and drove in tense silence for 10 minutes before Garrett finally spoke. "Who the hell are you?" James didn't answer immediately. He was staring out the window, his mind still processing the tactical data, already planning the next move. "Someone who's going to help you," he said finally. "That's not an answer." James turned to look at him, and for the first time, Garrett saw the full weight of the man sitting next to him. This wasn't just a good Samaritan. This was a warrior. "My name is Senior Chief Petty Officer James Mallory," James said, "United States Navy." "SEAL Team." Garrett's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "A SEAL." "Yeah. And you just happened to walk into a veterinary clinic at exactly the right moment?" James allowed himself a small, grim smile. "Call it fate." They drove back to the clinic where Sarah was waiting, her face tight with worry. Gunnar was stabilized, sleeping soundly on the exam table, his breathing steady. When she saw James, the relief on her face was palpable. "You're alive." "For now," James said. He quickly briefed her on what they'd found: the weapons, the facility, the patrol. Sarah's face went pale. "This is bigger than we thought." "Yeah," James said, "and Cross isn't going to let it go. He'll come after all of us now." Garrett slumped into a chair, the weight of the situation crushing him. "We can't fight this. He's too powerful." "We need to run." James shook his head. "Running won't help. He'll hunt you down. The only way out of this is to expose him. To bring in federal authorities and take down the entire operation." How? Sarah asked. We have photos, but that's not enough. We need hard evidence, documents, financial records, something that ties Cross directly to the weapons. James was silent for a long moment. Then he looked at Odin, who was sitting calmly by his side, his intelligent eyes watching his handler. We go back, James said. Tonight, we infiltrate the facility, we get the evidence we need, and we end this. Garrett stared at him in disbelief. You're insane. That place is crawling with armed guards. I know, James said calmly, but I've been in worse situations. He looked at Sarah, his gray eyes steady. I need you to stay here with Gunner. If we don't come back, you take everything we've documented and you go straight to the FBI field office in Denver. Do you understand? Sarah wanted to argue, but she saw the determination in his eyes. Be careful, she said quietly. James nodded. Then he and Odin walked out into the night, ready to finish what they'd started. Before they left for the final mission, James did something he hadn't done in years. He called for backup. He pulled out his encrypted phone and dialed a number he hadn't used since his last deployment. It was answered on the second ring. Granite? A familiar voice said. That you? Yeah, Hawk, James said. It's me. Lieutenant Commander Marcus. Hawk Reyes was James's former teammate, now stationed at Naval Special Warfare Group headquarters in Virginia. They had served together for 8 years, and Hawk was one of the few people James trusted completely. I need a favor, James said. Name it. James quickly explained the situation, the weapons smuggling, the Caldwell Group, the facility. I'm going to infiltrate tonight and gather evidence. But if this goes sideways, I need you to make sure the information gets to the right people. Where are you? Pine Ridge, Colorado. There was a pause. I'll make some calls, Hawk said. FBI's Rocky Mountain Safe Streets Task Force has jurisdiction. I'll loop them in. But Granite, if you're going into a hostile facility alone— I'm not alone, James said, looking at Odin. I've got my partner. Hawk sighed. Stay safe, brother. Always. James hung up and turned to Garrett. I need you to stay here with Dr. Chen. Protect her. If Cross sends anyone, you call 911 and you don't try to be a hero. Understand? Garrett nodded, his face grim. James knelt next to Gunner, who was now awake, his eyes clear and focused. The dog's tail wagged, weakly, and James gently scratched behind his ears. You're a good boy, he said softly. You're going to be okay. He stood and looked at Sarah. Thank you for what you did, for both of them. Sarah reached out and squeezed his hand. Come back safe. James didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He simply nodded, turned, and walked out into the darkness with Odin at his side. The final battle was about to begin. The Caldwell Group facility was a different place at 0200 hours. The floodlights were still blazing, but the frantic energy of earlier had settled into a routine patrol pattern. The guards had relaxed, convinced that the intruder from earlier had fled and wouldn't be stupid enough to return. They were wrong. James approached from the east this time, moving through the densest part of the forest, using terrain features to mask his approach. He was dressed in dark clothing, his face smeared with dirt to eliminate shine, and he moved with the practiced silence of a ghost. Odin was at his side, equally invisible, his body low, his movements precise. They stopped at the tree line, 200 yards from the compound, and James pulled out his binoculars. 4 guards visible, 2 on patrol, 2 stationary near the main storage building. Security cameras on the corners of each building. A single point of entry, a side door on the western storage unit, currently unguarded. James's mind worked through the problem with tactical precision. He needed to get inside, access the facility's computer systems, and download financial records and shipping manifests that would tie Cross to the weapons. But first, he needed to neutralize the security system. He scanned the compound again and spotted what he was looking for. A junction box on the exterior wall of the main building, likely housing the power for the cameras and lights. Odin, heel, he whispered. They moved forward, staying low, using the shadows cast by the floodlights to their advantage. When they reached the David perimeter fence, a simple chain-link barrier, James produced a pair of wire cutters from his pack and made a clean, silent cut, creating an opening just large enough for them to slip through. They were inside. James moved along the wall of the nearest building, his breathing controlled, his senses hyper-alert. A guard walked past, not 20 feet away, his rifle slung over his shoulder, talking on a radio. James and Odin froze, blending into the shadow. The guard passed without seeing them. They reached the junction box. James opened it carefully, studying the wiring inside. He identified the main power line for the security system and pulled a small electronic device from his pack, a signal jammer he'd kept from his last deployment. He attached it to the line and activated it. The cameras went dark. The guards noticed immediately, their radios crackling with alarm. "Power's out on the security grid. Check the junction box." James had maybe 3 minutes before they came to. Investigate. He moved quickly to the side door, tested the handle locked, and pulled out a lockpick set. 30 seconds later, the door swung open. He and Odin slipped inside. The interior of the storage building was a smuggler's dream. Rows of wooden crates stretched from floor to ceiling, each one stenciled with shipping codes and destination labels. James pulled out his phone and began photographing everything, moving quickly down the aisles. Then he found it. A small office in the back corner, lit by a single desk lamp. Inside was a laptop, still open, still powered on. James sat down and began searching the files. What he found made his blood run cold. The Caldwell Group wasn't just smuggling weapons. They were supplying terrorist cells. The shipping manifests showed deliveries to shell companies in Syria, Yemen, and Somalia, all known hotbeds of extremist activity. The financial records showed payments from offshore accounts linked to organizations on the FBI's most wanted list. This wasn't just a local crime, this was a national security threat. James plugged in a USB drive and began downloading everything. That's when Odin growled, a low warning sound that sent ice through James's veins. He spun in his chair, his hand going to his knife. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the harsh light from the compound, was Damon Cross. He was holding a pistol, aimed directly at James's chest. "I underestimated you," Cross said, his voice calm. "That was a mistake." James stood slowly, his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. "It's over, Cross. The FBI is already on their way. Everything you've built here is finished." Cross smiled. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Cross's smile faltered. Behind him, James could see movement guards converging on the building, alerted by their boss. This was about to get very bad, very fast. But James had one more card to play. "Odin," he said quietly, "watch." The Malinois shifted, his body coiling, his eyes locked on. Cross. Cross saw it and took a step back, his gun wavering. "Call off your dog." "No," James said. "You're going to put down the gun. You're going to order your men to stand down. And you're going to wait here until the authorities arrive. Or Odin is going to tear you apart before you can pull that trigger." Cross's hand was shaking now. He was a man used to being in control, used to having power. But in this moment, facing a Navy SEAL and a trained military K-9, he realized he had none. "You're insane?" Cross whispered. "Maybe," James said, "but I'm also right." The sound of sirens split the night, distant at first, but growing louder. Cross's face went white. James allowed himself a small, cold smile. "I told you, it's over." The FBI arrived in force. 6 black SUVs, 2 armored tactical vehicles, and a helicopter circling overhead. By the time they stormed the compound, James was sitting calmly in the office, Odin at his side, with Damon Cross and 4 of his guards, zip-tied and sitting on the floor. Special Agent Maria Delgado, the lead investigator for the Rocky Mountain Safe Streets Task Force, walked into the office, her dark eyes taking in the scene with professional assessment. "Senior Chief Mallory?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You've had a busy night." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the laptop, the USB drive, and the stacks of manifests James had laid out on the desk. "Is this everything?" "Yes, ma'am. Financial records, shipping manifests, communications logs. Everything you need to take down the entire network." Delgado nodded slowly, a look of genuine respect crossing her face. "You did good work here, Chief. This operation has been on our radar for 6 months, but we couldn't get close. You just handed us the case of the year." James stood and gestured to Cross. "He's the head. But there are others. This is a coordinated network. You'll want to move fast before they scatter." "Already on it," Delgado said. "We've got teams moving on 17 locations, across 4 states. She looked at Odin, who sat at perfect attention, his eyes calm and alert. "That's one hell of a partner you've got there." James rested a hand on Odin's head. "The best." The takedown of the Caldwell Group made national news. By dawn, the FBI had arrested 32 individuals, seized over $2 million in illegal weapons, and shut down one of the largest arms smuggling operations in the western United States. Damon Cross was charged with weapons trafficking, conspiracy to commit terrorism, and attempted murder. He would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. But for James, the mission wasn't complete until he returned to the veterinary clinic. He walked in just as the sun was rising, exhaustion pulling at every muscle in his body, but his spirit lighter than it had been in years. Sarah was at her desk, paperwork spread out in front of her, her eyes red from lack of sleep. When she saw him, she stood up so fast her chair toppled over. "You're alive." "Yeah," James said. "It's done." Garrett emerged from the back room, Gunnar walking slowly at his side. The German shepherd was still weak, but his eyes were clear, and his tail wagged when he saw James and Odin. Odin approached Gunnar carefully, sniffing him, and then gently touched his nose to the older dog's muzzle. It was a gesture of respect, of recognition, one warrior to another. James knelt and scratched both dogs behind their ears. "You're both good boys," he said softly. Sarah wiped her eyes, overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment. "They're charging Cross with everything. The news is saying this was one of the biggest weapons busts in the country." "It was," James said. "And it's because you two refused to back down. You did this." Garrett shook his head. "No, you did this. We just needed someone to believe us." James stood and looked at the two of them, a veterinarian and a rancher, ordinary people who had been thrust into extraordinary circumstances and had refused to break. "Heroes come in all forms," he said. "You're proof of that." In the weeks that followed, Pine Ridge slowly returned to normal. The Caldwell Group's assets were seized by the federal government, and Garrett Voss's land was returned to him free and clear. The corrupt officials who had been on Caldwell's payroll were exposed and removed from office. The town held a meeting, and for the first time in a year, people felt safe. Sheriff Miller, who had not been part of the corruption, publicly thanked James for his service and presented him with a key to the town, a symbolic gesture, but one that meant everything to the people of Pine Ridge. Dr. Sarah Chen's clinic saw a surge in business as word spread about her bravery. And Gunnar, the German shepherd, who had been poisoned as a warning, made a full recovery. He would live the rest of his days on Garrett's ranch, chasing cattle, sleeping in the sun, and serving as a reminder that even the most vulnerable can survive if someone is willing to stand up for them. On James's last day in Pine Ridge, before he returned to active duty, the town threw a small gathering at the local community center. It wasn't a grand affair, just coffee, homemade pastries, and a room full of grateful people who wanted to say thank you. James stood uncomfortably in the center of the room, Odin at his side, as person after person came up to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him what his actions had meant to them. Sarah approached, holding a small box wrapped in simple brown paper. "This is for you," she said. "For both of you." James opened it. Inside were 2 hand-carved wooden figures, a man and a dog, standing side by side. "I commissioned a local artist to make them," Sarah said. "It's not much, but I wanted you to have something to remember us by." James felt his throat tighten. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I'll treasure this." Garrett walked over, Gunnar limping slightly but strong, and extended his hand. "I don't know how to repay you." James shook his hand firmly. "You already have. You stood up when it mattered. That's all any of us can do." He looked down at Gunnar and Odin, who were sitting together, two warriors who had survived their own battles. "Take care of him," James said. "He's earned his rest." "I will," Garrett promised. As James drove away from Pine Ridge, the mountains rising behind him, Odin asleep in the passenger seat, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the knowledge that he had used his skills, his training, and his strength to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. He had been a weapon forged in war, but he had chosen to be a shield for the innocent, and in doing so, he had reminded himself why he had become a SEAL in the first place. Not for glory, not for recognition, but to stand between the darkness and the light. This story is not just about a Navy SEAL and his loyal K-9. It's about the choice we all face when confronted with evil. Do we look away? Do we stay silent? Do we convince ourselves that it's not our problem? Or do we stand up even when we're afraid, even when the odds are against us, and fight for what's right? James Mallory chose to stand. Dr. Sarah Chen chose to stand. Garrett Voss chose to stand. And because they did, a town was saved, a criminal network was destroyed, and justice was served. Heroes are not always soldiers. They're not always dressed in uniforms or carrying weapons. Sometimes they're veterinarians. Sometimes they're ranchers. Sometimes they're ordinary people who do extraordinary things because they refuse to let fear win. The bond between a warrior and his K-9 is sacred. It's built on trust, loyalty, and an unbreakable commitment to protect one another no matter the cost. But the bond between good people, people who stand together against darkness, is just as powerful. And it's a reminder that no matter how bleak things seem, no matter how powerful the forces of evil appear to be, courage and compassion will always find a way to triumph. To the real military working dogs and their handlers who serve in silence, who risk everything to keep us safe, thank you. To the ordinary people who choose to be heroes when the moment calls, thank you. And to anyone watching this who has ever felt powerless in the face of injustice, remember this: you are stronger than you think. You are braver than you know. And when you stand up for what's right, you are never alone. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that heroes still exist. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments. What was your favorite moment? Was it Odin's loyalty, James's courage, or the moment justice was served? We read every comment. God bless, and see you in the next story.